As an Asian American anti-racism activist in a society where conversations about race typically focus on black versus white, I'm frequently asked where I think Asian Americans fit in. Interestingly, I find that even individuals who identify as Asian American frequently have poorly developed ideas about this. I'm Jessica Gu, and this is Stories About Asian Americans, from Yellow Peril to Model Minority. Two major objectives in this presentation. The first is to explain how American history has influenced current stereotypes of Asian Americans. The second is to debunk the model minority myth. We'll start by examining stereotypes that exist about Asian Americans, the stories that are told about Asian Americans. Specifically, we'll look at the model minority stereotype, and through a brief look at Asian American Pacific Islander history, understand where its political origins come from. Then we'll look at some data. Data that represents the true Asian American story, the experience that is actually lived and from the perspective of Asian Americans. The most recent stereotype is the Asian terrorist. But long before September 11th, Asians were already seen as a threat to national security. They were dangerous Chinese spies carrying exotic-looking trinkets. Perhaps the most familiar historical event was the Japanese internment during World War II. Japanese Americans were held captive during the war out of fear they would be more sympathetic to their, quote, home country. As we know, German and Italian Americans suffered no such scrutiny. All of these stem from the same stereotype that's called the perpetual foreigner, that no matter how many generations of your family might have lived here, there's still something about you that isn't totally American. Then there's the convenience store laundry cleaner stereotype. And finally, the model minority stereotype. Because the other stereotypes are negative ones, I think it's clear why they're toxic. The insidious nature of the model minority stereotype, though, deserves some more focus. Understanding the model minority requires at least a cursory understanding of Asian American Pacific Islander history. At its very base, it's important to understand that AAPI is a grouping based on geography, not community, shared identity, language, culture. Asia is the largest inhabited continent in the world, and it's not a natural identity. For example, I live on the continent of North America, and I very rarely say that I'm North American. However, I frequently identify as a citizen of the United States. So already, even the concept of Asian American has roots as an imposed definition from those outside of the Asian American group. Because of that, AAPI history is complex and one of many, many different threads. This review is not meant to be complete or exhaustive, but simply a way of understanding the concept of the model minority in its historical context. For decades, Asians were seen as a threat to American, European, Caucasian-dominated culture. So how did we get from yellow peril to model minority? Let's take a moment to consider how even complementary stereotypes can be damaging. Consider a similar positive stereotype, that black people are good at dancing. The issue with positive stereotypes is that implies the negative statement is also true. Consider these next two statements. Women are emotionally smart. This implies that women are not smart at anything else, or that men are not emotionally smart. Men are good at science implies that women are not good at science. Similarly, black people are good at dancing implies that black people have no other skills to offer society. And that's reinforced and illustrated by the fact that society frequently tells black people that really the only way for them to succeed in any great way is through sports and entertainment. As for Asians are hardworking, this stereotype implies that Asians can only succeed at things that require elbow grease, that other things such as leadership or arts that require creativity are outside the reach of what Asian Americans are good at. Even our understanding of stereotypes is problematic. Everybody can concede that stereotyping is unfair because it encourages people to generalize and draw conclusions that cannot be applied to any specific individual. However, most people would say that though they know that's a limitation of stereotypes, there's some grain of truth in them, that they reflect a trend of behavior or characteristics amongst a group of people. This implies that the chain of events is that first, there's a form of behavior that is inherently common. Then that's generalized into a stereotype. But what that fails to take into account are forces that might cause those behaviors. A counter theory would be that certain external forces exist, forces such as policies, discrimination, and armed conflict. These exert pressures on a group of people that impact their behavior and life decisions. Because the pressure is the same across the group of people, the responses are also similar, thus creating a trend. That trend is then generalized into a stereotype. Let's look back at the Asian shop owner, laundry cleaner stereotype. Is it really that Asian Americans are inherently good at running small businesses or obsessed with cleaning clothes? Or could it be a legacy from the discrimination that forced Asian Americans into self-employment? In the 1800s, there was a backlash against Asian laborers. As one Chinese man recounted, you couldn't work in the cigar factories or the jute or the woolen mills anymore. All the Chinese had been driven out. About all they could be was laundrymen or vegetable peddlers. Understanding Asian American history helps us understand the external pressures that have created the current stereotypes about Asian people. Here's an abbreviated timeline of Asian American history. I've split it up into 3 sections, so at the top here I have historical landmarks, events that we're all familiar with to give us an idea of what was going on at that time. In the middle, we have Asian American specific events. In the bottom third, I have African American events, so that we can sort of compare those timelines in parallel. The first point that I'd like to make is that Asian Americans have been in the United States for a really long time. The first wave of immigration that came was in the early 1800s, mostly Chinese immigrants when they'd heard about the gold rush. After that, more and more Asian immigrants came, mostly responding to a need for labor. Hawaii started importing a lot of Asian laborers, Korean, Japanese, Filipino, Chinese. And of course, when America started building the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of Chinese immigrants were hired to do that. Even as early as then, Americans with privilege were exploiting racial differences. In Hawaii and in the Transcontinental Railroad times, they frequently would make working groups based on each country or each race and pit them against either white workers or each other in order to exact more work for less money. It's important to note that most of these immigrants were not really working as free laborers. It was a pretty standard indentured servitude that employers would pay for their travel from their home country to this country in return for their work. At the end of a long year, they would get a sheet back that said this is how much they owed, this is how much they made, minus deductions for food and housing, and by the end of the year they still owed a lot of money. Would you, by the way, like to sign up for another year of working? By the late 1800s, Asian Americans had been here for so long that they had already begun to petition for citizenship rights. At that time, only white people could be citizens. And so in 1878, there was the Al Yup decision, which was an Asian American who had been born in this country. And it was decided that Asian Americans were considered to be colored and thus did not deserve citizenship rights. During that time, Asian Americans were welcomed. They were recruited to come to fill the big labor needs. However, by the late 1800s, there began to have a shift in the perception of Asian Americans. While initially they were seen as cheap labor, there started to be enough Asian Americans around that xenophobia took over. It was a really famous time when Sam Gompers was organizing the AFL, and one of their largest campaigns was white versus Asian, American versus Asian coolieism, and this idea that Asian Americans were stealing the jobs of white Americans and undermining the culture of the United States. As you can see then, looking in the Asian American events section, there's a rapid succession of anti-Asian immigration. So in 1882 marked the first of this. It was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically barred more Chinese people from immigrating. Then came the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, where the U.S. asked Japan not to send any more Japanese immigrants. In 1910, Angel Island opened. Angel Island is frequently called the Ellis Island of the West. Though we're all really taught about Ellis Island, not many of us are taught about Angel Island. It was opened from 1910 to 1940, and over 1 million immigrants came from the Asian countries through that station. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese people were barred from coming in. On the other hand, immigrants frequently had no money for a ticket home, and so there were many folks who stayed there for years. The Alien Land Law was passed, preventing Asian Americans from owning land. The Asian Exclusion Act was a reiteration of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In that time, there was a series of different court cases petitioning for citizenship for Asian Americans, and they were all denied. What's really interesting about this time is right before 1900, the Philippines became a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War. When we were given the Philippines, there was a Filipino uprising petitioning for independence that was quelled by the U.S. Army. But this led to a conundrum for U.S. lawmakers, because between the time in which the Philippines became a U.S. territory and the time when the Philippines were allowed to have their independence, there was no way to prevent Filipino immigrants from coming. They were part of our country. So that was the motivation for the Philippine Independence Act in the 1930s, so that we could stop Filipino immigration. That leads into World War II. And World War II was a really pivotal moment because after World War II, the US was forced to look at our racial issues. So, of course, there was the famous Japanese internment. And one of the major issues that was brought up during World War II was the moral high ground that we sat on. It was pretty hypocritical to both scold the Germans for their acts, but continue to have legislated differences between races in this country. And the African American civil rights movement started. And what's really interesting is that as that period happened, when we won the Civil Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, the Voting Rights Act, that was also the same time that there was a bunch of repeals of anti-Asian American legislation. So we also saw in that time the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act and alien land laws. It's not a coincidence that Asian Americans and African Americans won huge civil liberties at the same time. One of the biggest reversals was immigration policy. So after the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was still a strict system of quotas for immigration. Only a small number of people could immigrate from Asian countries every year. And in the 1960s, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, which opened up the number of people that could immigrate. Instead of using quotas, it was now focused on family reunification. So now, if you lived in an Asian country but had family in the U.S. already, it was easier for you to immigrate. Additionally, it opened up the doors for Asians who didn't have family members here already. This was the birth of what we recognize as sort of modern immigration philosophy now. I think we're all familiar with work visas and student visas and how employers can petition for expedited visa processes for their employees. This was all from the Immigration and Nationality Act. The idea that we were going to open up immigration, but we were also going to focus largely on those with skills. So people with higher education typically, engineers, doctors, people with college and graduate degrees. Shortly thereafter, the model minority phrase was coined. It first came out in the 1960s in a Newsweek article. So why the 1960s? Why the sudden change of heart? It relates, again, directly to the interwoven histories of people of color in this country. The middle of the 60s was the height of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And leading up to this point, Asian Americans and Black Americans had won, in somewhat in alliance, several great gains. What the model minority concept describes is the success of Asian American immigrants. And while that seems benign on the surface, what it really says is, hey, Black people, look, Asian people did it, so you should be able to too. It's evidence that we're post-racial now. It emphasizes the idea of a meritocracy in this country, and even more importantly, it was a way of minimizing the racism against Black Americans. The brilliance of the model minority concept politically is that it takes a seemingly positive comment and uses it to absolve the white establishment from responsibility over racism. Additionally, it drove a huge wedge between Asian Americans and Black Americans. You've all seen what happens in classroom when there's a teacher's pet picked. Classmates can't help but resent them. And so it was a way of fracturing people of color to reduce their power. At the same time, the 1900s marked a period of significant instability in the Asian continent. So if we look back at the historical landmarks, right before 1910, Japan colonized Korea. Then we had the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Laotian Civil War, the Vietnam War, and the killing fields in Cambodia. In each one of these conflicts, not only was a civil war going on, but the U.S. government took an opportunity to exploit the situation for its own interests. So during the Chinese Civil War, the U.S. backed the Chiang Kai-shek Army, which is now the government that resides in Taiwan. During the Laotian Civil War, CIA agents employed the minority Hmong in their, quote, secret war, and then abandoned them when they lost, leaving them targets in their own country. Obviously, we're very familiar with the American involvement in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And this great instability, much of which was exacerbated by the U.S., created a whole other wave of immigration. Immigrants that came to this country not out of their own volition, but because they were forced to flee at sometimes only a moment's notice with only the clothes on their back. So it created this interesting dichotomy. The Immigration and Nationality Act focused on the most privileged, and of course the refugee population came to this country with very little privilege. Then we move forward into the 2000s, where we sort of enter the modern age of the Asian terrorist. So September 11th marked a huge wave of hate crimes against Muslim Americans as well as Sikh Americans because they were mistaken for Muslim Americans, and we entered the war in Afghanistan. That brings us forward into the Black Lives Matter movement and current day. Another event worth mentioning was the Rodney King beating and riots. In the early 1990s, a bystander captured on video a brutal attack of Rodney King by several LA police officers. When all of those police officers were acquitted of any charges, racial tensions in LA exploded and there was a huge riot. Not only did the Rodney King riots highlight race issues between white Americans and black Americans, it highlighted issues between the Korean community and African Americans. In fact, most of the casualties and costs from the riots were not actually directed at white Americans, but Korean shop owners. It was a great example of misunderstanding between the black community and Asian American communities since the creation of the model minority concept. In summary, racism and bigotry against Asian Americans is not a thing of the past. Just like all other forms of modern racism, it's simply less overt. We have a different history and context than other people of color, but they are related and interwoven. White politics has told stories about Asian Americans to their benefit. We must tell our own stories. Aaron Magruder, the writer and creator of Boondocks, has a brilliant series of comics in 2011 following the September 11th tragedy that I think illustrates these points well. Let's take a closer look at the model minority stereotype and the data that people have cited to support it. During Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, he revitalized the idea of the model minority that was first coined in the 1960s. He thanked Asian Americans for the realization of the American dream. We've already discussed how this was a way to falsely diminish racism against black Americans and absolve white Americans of any responsibility. The major statistic he used was the median household income. As he noted, Asian Americans were making $53,845 as comparison to the $47,951 that white households were making. But what was failed to be mentioned was the statistics of the number of workers per family. On average, Asian American families had 0.5 more workers. If you look at median personal income, you can see that even in 2010, 30 years later, Asian Americans make less than their white counterparts. Additionally, these statistics fail to take into account where Asian Americans tend to live. New York, San Francisco, LA, mostly large, expensive urban centers. It's simply not accurate to compare income of white Americans that are more evenly distributed throughout the country to the income of Asian Americans. If we look at my own profession, the number of Asian American students is growing in medical schools. The stereotype would say that even if all Asian Americans are not doing well, surely the scientists are. At the National Institute of Health, 21.5% of their scientists are Asian American Pacific Islander, and yet only 4.7% of lab or branch directors are Asian American Pacific Islander. In Silicon Valley, over 30% of engineers are AAPI, and only 6% of board members and 10% of corporate officers are AAPI. And finally, Asian Americans make up 4.8% of the U.S. population and only 0.3% of corporate officers. That's a 16-fold difference. And what about public perception? If the model minority idea is so pervasive, Asian Americans should at least reap the benefits of being seen positively. But the Committee of 100 did a survey in 2011, and they asked Americans if they felt uncomfortable voting for a presidential candidate from a specific minority group. 23% of respondents said that they felt uncomfortable voting for an Asian American presidential candidate. They also asked about interracial marriage approval. 24% of respondents said they did not approve of Asian American white interracial marriage. In reality, what explains the apparent success of Asian Americans is not a meritocracy, but a direct result from American immigration policy. When the quotas were lifted in 1965, the number of immigrants from Asia increased, but it was only a selected population. Unless you already had family in the U.S., immigrants were selected for specific skills. In other words, people with college and graduate degrees. The model minority phrase was coined, as if it were a natural phenomenon and not a direct result of American policy. If you only allow people with educational and financial privilege to immigrate, their children inherit that privilege. We know that one of the strongest predictors of going to college is having a parent that went to college. Ironically, what white politicians have tried to use to prove that the meritocracy exists, Asian American achievement, actually proves that it doesn't. Because Asian American immigrants that arrived with privilege have done better than those who arrived without. In general, immigrants from Asia come from two major groups: educated workers and refugees. The problem with Asian American statistics is when you take two such disparate groups, they average out to the middle. This aggregated data masks true disparities. This is data from a survey in Los Angeles County. Rates of poverty in specific Asian American communities are higher than all of LA County averaged together, and far higher than white Americans. Over 1 in 2 Hmong in LA live below the federal poverty line. Because of the race dynamics in this country, Black Americans are typically seen as a barometer. If you're doing as bad as Black people, then you're doing pretty bad. Here's the poverty rate of African Americans in LA County that year. Here's the rate for below 200% of the federal poverty line. Hmong, Cambodian, Tongan, Samoan, Bangladeshi, Laotian. All of these Asian subgroups have far higher poverty rates. But the aggregated data and stereotyping obscures this truth, preventing those groups from getting greatly needed aid. This feeling that Asian Americans are doing well prevents us from noticing even disparities between aggregated data of Asian Americans and white Americans. A study at UCSF looked at diabetes rates, higher not only in disaggregated API subgroups, but even in aggregated API. We're told over and over and over again in med school that Black Americans have higher rates of heart disease and diabetes compared to whites, but rarely, if ever, is it mentioned that that's true for Asian Americans as well. This impression of false well-being makes Asian Americans an invisible minority. A review was done of all health-related research as part of creating the federal government's Healthy People 2010 goals. Despite the fact that AAPI make up almost 5% of the U.S. population, only 0.2% of federal grants and 0.01% of articles even mention AAPIs. In summary, the model minority stereotype is not only false, but incredibly toxic. It creates a false perception of race parity between Asian Americans and white Americans. That means discrimination goes unrecognized, support is not provided, and research is not done where it needs to be, and Asian Americans can internalize a false identity. Perpetuates the myth of a meritocracy. It's divisive between members of the Asian diaspora, and it's divisive between people of color. Mainstream America has this uncanny ability to hold contradictory perceptions. We're all familiar with these two incompatible viewpoints of Latino and Chicano immigrants. Each is used when it better suits the needs of the majority class. Asian Americans face a similar duality. AAPIs are used as, quote, teachers' pets when it's useful to undermine the Black Civil Rights Movement. Yet we're paid less and given less positions of leadership. Furthermore, despite having lived in this country for over 100 years, we're still seen as other, as foreigner, subject to discrimination and tragic hate crimes. We need to transform the conversation from stories about Asian Americans to Asian American stories.